The fourth logical fallacy we're going to talk about in this series is a misleading analogy. This is sometimes also referred to as a false analogy. Either is an acceptable title for it. They both mean the same thing. When we have a misleading analogy, we are equating two things that are not actually related to each other in order to prove your point. So an analogy is comparing two things, saying that two things are similar. When we do that in a misleading or in a false way, we know that those two things are not really similar, but we say that they are. We kind of want them to be in order to prove our point. This is a logical fallacy because the whole basis of the argument depends on those two things being related. So if they aren't actually related, there is really no truth to what you are trying to prove. I've got a couple examples here, but if you click, I have it linked here. I'll also put it in the description of the video. This is from the Texas State Department of Philosophy. For example, we'll go over two examples. This first one says people who buy stocks are no different from people who bet on horse racing. They both risk their money with little chance of making a big profit. Okay. So the reason this is an analogy to start is we are comparing two things. We are comparing people who buy stocks, and we are comparing them to people who bet on horse racing. And in this analogy, they are saying that they are the same. That's what makes it an analogy. What makes it a misleading or a false analogy is that there is a difference, right? Stocks tend to follow patterns. Of course, there are exceptions, and of course, there are unexpected turns. But there is a different level of control that is just lost with the horse racing, right? Again, you might say, okay, but they are pretty similar. And maybe they are, but setting up the argument that they are the same in this format is logically unsound. Second example we have would be the argument people who have to have a cup of coffee every morning before they can function have no less a problem than alcoholics who have to have their alcohol each day to sustain them, right? This is an example of a misleading analogy that I actually see a decent amount of, sometimes just swapping out the coffee for something else. So in this case, it's an analogy because we are comparing coffee drinkers to alcoholics here. It is a false analogy though because it is different, right? They are not the same thing. Very different effects, very different, everything. I'm sure I don't need to get into it too much, right? So that's why these are both good examples of misleading analogies. If they sound convincing at first, that's okay. Don't feel stupid or anything. That's the goal of logical fallacies, is to get a statement that kind of gets lodged in your head that kind of makes you think. That's the tricky part, is being able to analyze whether or not there is actually any sort of foundation to that, or whether in the case of these two, we have been misled.